Howdy folks, Spencer here, and today I'll be going over the best Zen ships in Star Trek Online as of March 2025. Every single ship in this video has a cost of 3,000 Zen in the store and can be acquired via Tier 6 coupons. As always, chapters to each topic are listed below. Now, before I get too far into things, I do have a couple of quick notes. The first of which is just a recap on the three main reasons that people buy ships in this game. Reason one is simply because you like the ship. That could be for role-playing purposes, or it could just be that you just really like the visuals of it. Reason two is because the ship itself has a good setup and performs quite well. And reason three is because the accessories from the ship, such as the trader console, perform really well for a specific playstyle, and often in those cases, those are items that can be taken off and used on other ships that you own. And on another note, I know the timing for this video is a bit awkward with the 15th bundle less than a week away on PC. So if you're in a position where you have unrestricted T6 coupons, I'd recommend you wait for my coverage of the 15th bundle to drop before making your final decision. Once that coverage is up, I'll have it linked in the pinned comment below, along with a short write-up for any new additions that you may want to consider. But the reality is, many of you still have restricted coupons from event campaigns that you want to use, which likely won't be usable on the new 15th bundle ships until they're no longer flagged as new by the game. And for those of you going for the entire 15th bundle, we've seen every bundle for the past couple of years include a Tier 6 coupon, so you'll likely be looking for some recommendations as well. So having some up-to-date recommendations out there is beneficial even if we don't have the full information on the 15th bundle yet. And two final notes here. If I don't mention a ship, that doesn't automatically mean that it's bad. There's hundreds of Tier 6 ships in STO, and the simple reality is, not all of them can make a best of list. And lastly, with the number of ships I'm covering today, if a ship is special specifically for its layout or accessories, I'm going to tunnel in on what makes it notable and gloss over the rest. I don't want to waste your time. The first category here is the best overall ships. The 10 ships in this category are either incredibly powerful or offer substantial value to multiple playstyles. As many of you likely expected, the first and most important ship in this entire video is the Ahwahnee Command Carrier. This is a ship that some have mistakenly written off due to being a 3-3 science carrier, and yes, while the ship itself is not the most impressive, some of the accessories from it are best in slot, and they can be used on any of your other ships. The first of which is the Fleet Power Network Array console. This provides a massive amount of energy weapon haste to yourself or your targeted ally, and up to 12 of the pets owned by the targeted player. The amount of haste this provides scales up with your aux power. The tooltip there lists up to 125% at max aux power, but by using abilities like Intel's Override Subsystem Safeties to go over the 125 aux power cap, you can get more than 125% haste for your energy weapons from this for 35 seconds. In addition, it also has a chance to provide a random firing mode every few seconds if you don't already have one active. So whether you use energy weapons, have pets using energy weapons, or trying to buff up someone else that is using energy weapons, this console is best in slot. In addition, the Ahwahnee unlocks the Type 7 shuttlecraft hangar pets. These are really powerful. They're some of the best hangar pets in the entire game. Basically, if you have a hangar base slot and you don't want to slot a bunch of stuff to try and buff up a hangar pet to get damage from it, you can just slot Type 7s, and they're not going to do much damage themselves, but they're going to debuff things for you. Debuff is a force multiplier, allowing you and your teammates to do more damage against the enemies by reducing their resistance, quite often into negative values. And while it's not as impressive as the other two accessories, the flagship staffing trait that comes with the Ahwahnee is also quite good. It does have an internal lockout, which is 30 seconds if I recall, so it's got a third uptime, but that is still a little bit of extra firing cycle haste that you're going to be able to benefit from. It also has some cooldown reduction on it for non-specialization firing modes, but not below the shared cooldown. So it's a good budget trait, and given you'd be picking up the Ahwahnee for the other accessories, it is certainly something you could use on a budget build until you have access to some of the better traits out there. Next up is the Atlantis Temporal Destroyer. This is currently the best energy weapon DPS platform that you can pick up for 3,000 Zen or with a Tier 6 coupon. This has a 5-2 weapon setup plus an experimental weapon slot. For the Bridge Officer setup, you've got a Lieutenant TAC, a Commander TAC with Temporal Operative, an Ensign Engineer, a Lieutenant Commander Science, and a Lieutenant Commander Universal with Intel. So you have the very coveted Temp and Intel specialization combo that is really popular for the current Uncon meta, and you're able to run all of those temporal and intel abilities while still having access to a Lieutenant Commander Science for Gravwell 1. If you're familiar with the mirror angle setups that myself, Mara, and a few others have been running, you can very closely copy that build over to the Atlantis here, and while you're not going to have the hangar bay, you're still going to get very good performance from this setup. Console-wise, it's 5 TAC, 2 engine, 4 psi. It's got a base turn rate of 15, impulse of 0.2, inertia of 60, and for the power buffs here, plus 10 to weapons and aux. It does, of course, have the ability to run dual cannons, being a destroyer, and I don't believe I mentioned these before, but it does have a hull and shield mod, each of 1.15. So it's not the most survivable ship out there, but it is a bit more survivable than some of the other escorts and raider type ships in the game. Overall, this is just a really, really solid platform for any energy weapon setup. So fire at will, beam overload, cannon rapid fire, cannon scatter volley, all of those builds are going to do very well on this ship. In addition, it has a really great starship trait, Temporal Tunneling. This is going to provide you with 100% firing cycle haste for energy weapons for 5 seconds whenever you hit exotic or temporal operative bridge officer abilities. This can only happen once every 15 seconds, so 1/3 uptime, but still, that's going to average out to around 33% firing cycle haste, which is really, really good. The other accessories are fine. The experimental weapon is nowhere near competitive to the hexacannons that I'll be talking about later off of the Achilles. And the console disassembler emitter, I believe some people have had a bit of success with as well. It is something I personally would drop once you have access to something better, but at a budget level, that's going to do perfectly fine. And next up is the Bozeman Intel Heavy Frigate. This is a ship that happens to be good on all fronts. The ship itself is good, and the accessories from it are all really quite good. And something very important to keep in mind with this ship is that it does have a fleet version. So if it is a ship that you actually want to fly long term, don't burn any of your T6X upgrades on the C-Store variant. Wait until you have the fleet one and use your upgrades on that. Upgrades on a C-Store ship will not carry over to the fleet version, and there is still a reason to go for the C-Store one even if you're going to go with the fleet one long term. The C-Store version is the one that has the accessories. The fleet version does not come with the consular trait, and by purchasing the C-Store version, you are going to discount the amount of fleet ship modules needed to acquire the fleet version from 5 down to 1. And for the stats of the C-Store version here, it's got a hull modifier of 1.15, shield mod of 0.95. It has a 5-3 weapon setup, 3 device slots. For the bridge officer setup, Commander Inge with Intel, Ensign Universal, Lieutenant Universal with Intel, and then 2 Lieutenant Commander Universals. So it has a very flexible bridge officer setup with all of those universals. That is a perk to the frigate line of ships. And another perk is with that, you're also going to be getting raider flanking with this ship. Now for the consoles, 3 TAC, 4 Inge, and 3 Psi. For the mobility stats, you've got a turn rate of 13, impulse mod of 0.17, inertia of 50, so this thing is going to move a bit better than your other engineering ships out there. For the power buffs, plus 10 to weapons and engines. It can use dual cannons or dual heavies. It does have a built-in cloaking device, just a standard non-combat one because of the commander intel. It's got the gather intel ship mechanic, and it does have some cruiser commands on it, the strategic maneuvering one and weapon system efficiency. And then it has the frigate mastery package. Now, for the fleet version of this ship, the changes are you're going to get an extra engineering console taking you from 4 up to 5, and then you get a 10% boost to the hull and shield mod, taking you up to a hull modifier of 1.265 and a shield mod of 1.045. So just like the Atlantis, this is a really great energy weapon platform. It's going to work with any of your standard firing modes like fire at will, beam overload, cannon scatter volley, cannon rapid fire. But with this also having a commander intel, you can do surgical strikes very well on this. Now, between this and the Atlantis is still the better DPS platform, but if you're looking for something a bit different, you don't care about the experimental weapon, then the Bozeman is a very capable option. Now, even if you go for the Atlantis, the Bozeman is still something you may want to pick up long term because the accessories on it are quite good. The starship trait is Temporal Surge, and this is actually an active ability, so this is not something that just is a passive effect. This is going to be an ability that you put on your tray and you activate when you want. So what Temporal Surge does is, for 10 seconds once you activate it, it's going to phase you out and you're going to become untargetable. It's going to give you a 100% crit chance for those 10 seconds and then a massive maneuverability buff. The only downside is it does have a fairly long recharge time, but by using intel abilities or by being cloaked, you can bring that down to a minimum recharge time of 40 seconds. It's not a trait that you're going to use all of the time, but there are some situations where this is quite beneficial to have on hand. And then we have the console Tachyon Netrons. The passives on this are 1% crit chance, 10% severity, and plus 76 starship perception. The clicky on this is really powerful if you're using it on a group of enemies that you, say, have grouped up in a Gravwell. The only downside to the clicky is it does have a 2-second activation time, but what it's going to do is it's going to deploy a Tachyon net around your enemy. Every enemy in that is going to receive a damage resistance debuff that is going to scale up based on your Ox power. It's going to reveal cloaked ships that are within the net, and whenever you get a critical hit on a foe in the net, it is going to apply some kinetic damage to them that ignores shields, and it will shut their shields offline for a couple of seconds. So again, if you're in a situation where you have enemies grouped up, this is an amazing console to have on hand. Next up is the Terran Adamant Intel Heavy Raider. The primary value here is from the ship and its console, but both the trait and the experimental weapon do also have some value for different playstyles. Starting with the ship stats, this has a hull modifier of 1.15, shield mod of 0.8, so shield mod is a bit lower than we've seen so far. This has a 5-1 weapon setup plus an experimental weapon. It has 2 device slots. For the bridge officer setup, a commander tack with intel, Ensign Universal, Lieutenant Universal with Temporal Operative, and 2 Lieutenant Commander Universals. Again, with the unconventional systems meta, Intel and Temp are the most desirable specializations that you can get on a ship, so seeing them both here is great. Though the Temporal Operative is just a lieutenant, so you're not going to be able to use abilities like Timeline Collapse or Recursive Shearing. But overall, with how flexible this bridge officer setup is, with everything other than the commander being universal, you have many different ways that you can set this ship up. Console-wise, 5 tack, 3 inch, and 3 psi. For the mobility stats, base turn rate of 20, impulse mod of 0.22, inertia of 75, so this thing is going to handle very, very well. Plus 20 to weapons power. It can, of course, use dual cannons, and it does have a combat cloaking device, so battle cloak. Being a raider, it does, of course, have raider flanking. And being an intel ship, it does also have those baked-in intel perks, like the Gather Intelligence mechanic. And for the mastery package, it has the Raider setup, so accuracy, defense, all weapon damage, and critical severity for weapons. And the console here is the Agony Redistributor. This is a console that was nerfed and then buffed back up, and it is currently in a very good state. It is, again, widely used. The passives on this are plus 10 to inertia rating and plus 17.1% flight speed, so this is a good set of mobility buffs. This is one of the few sources of getting inertia in the game. And for the clicky, this is a mark on target ability. Each second for 12 seconds, it is going to deal 33% of the damage you and your team did to the marked target in the last second, and deal that to up to 10 foes within 5 kilometers of the target. This damage is dealt as phaser damage and will both ignore enemy shields and half of their hull resistance. When timed well on a large target that has other foes around, this console can deal a substantial amount of damage. If you're using a third-party parser like Oscar, it is going to show up as whatever you marked it on, so if you're looking at a record DPS run, you're going to see it show up frequently as something like a cube or transformer. And for the other 2 accessories, the Starship trait and the experimental weapon, they don't see as much use, but there are still some people that do like them. For the Starship trait, this is Wild Weasel, and when you use evasive maneuvers or any Intel Bridge Officer ability, it's going to summon in a Wild Weasel shuttle to attract attention of nearby enemies for 20 seconds or until destroyed. So if you're looking for something at a budget level that would be able to draw some dread off of you, then those can help out. They're not going to be a game changer, but it's better than nothing, especially if you're, again, at a budget level. And then for the experimental weapon, this is the Terran Repeating Warhead Launcher. So this is basically just going to fire some quantum torps at a foe. It's not that powerful, but if you're doing a theme build, then this is something you're probably going to be interested in. And next up at number 5 is the only ship that we know anything about from the 15th anniversary bundle, and that is the Ark Royal Intel Science Carrier. There's been a few leaks out there for it, and I've got that all covered in the video that I'm going to have linked down below. But if the Ark Royal goes live with stats anywhere near what we've seen with those leaks, then the Ark Royal is going to be a very popular ship for exotic players, carrier players, and support-focused players. Next up is the Terran Hydra Intel Destroyer. This is good for the ship, the console, and the Starship trait. So starting with the stats, this has a hull modifier of 1.2, shield mod of 1.05. It has a 5.2 weapon setup. The blog, for some reason here, is saying 5.1, but it is actually 5.2. It has 2 device slots. For the bridge officer setup, a commander tack with intel, a lieutenant commander engineering with pilot, lieutenant science, lieutenant commander universal, and ensign universal. Intel pilot is not as good of a combo as Intel temporal, but pilot is in a much more competitive state than it was a couple years ago. They revamped it, and there are now some uncon procs for it. So with it being on the lieutenant commander engineer, you are able to put some pilot abilities in there that are going to be beneficial. Overall, for the bridge officer setup, it is very capable. This is a ship that does really well in PvE, and does also happen to be one of the top PvP platforms out there. And for the rest of the stats, you have 5 tack consoles, 3 engine, 3 psi. For the mobility, 14 turn rate, impulse mod of 0.18, 55 inertia. For the power buffs, plus 10 to weapons and engines. It does, again, have an experimental weapon slot, and it can use dual cannons or dual heavies. Being an intel ship, it does have the gather intel mechanic, and it does have a basic non-combat cloak. And the mastery package is the destroyer one, not the raider one listed on the picture here. But the buffs there are correct: accuracy, crit severity, crit chance, and then kinetic and energy damage. And the console here for the Hydra is harmonic yield distribution via radial aperture, or Hydra. The passives on this are plus 30% turn speed, flight speed, and damage for your hangar pets and targetable torpedoes, and then 20% increased cannon damage, Cat 1. For the clicky, this is going to summon all of your pets to yourself, and then they're going to fire cones of phaser damage in front of them. And if you're using this console on a Prometheus class variant, like the Terran Hydra, then you can use the multi-vector assault mode via this console. And then for the starship trait, this is Strike Group Command Authority. This is going to provide a bonus damage buff for your pets based on the strongest pet that you have out. So if you have a fighter out, and that's the highest ranked pet you have, that's 30% Cat 2 bonus damage. A frigate is 40% Cat 2 bonus damage, and then a multi-vector or a saucer out is 50% bonus damage. So to recap the Terran Hydra, the ship itself is good in PvE, and it's one of the best in PvP right now, and the console and starship trait off of it are really great for carrier-based builds. As for the experimental weapon, it's nothing you need to worry about. And next up is the Achilles American Worker Heavy Destroyer. The ship itself is fine, but the main appeal here comes from the experimental weapon, the console, and to some extent the starship trait. If you want to use this ship, it is able to perform very well in PvE, but the dual Merc Worker specialization seating on it is nowhere near as great as the Temp Intel combo that we saw on some of the other ships I've covered so far. So the most important accessory here is the experimental weapon, the prototype phaser hexacannons. This is the best experimental weapon in the entire game right now, so long as you can handle the 45-degree forward-facing targeting arc they have. Even on non-phaser setups, we are finding this is beating out pretty much every other experimental weapon out there, again, so long as you can handle that limited arc. So if you're looking for an experimental weapon, the prototype phaser hexacannons are what you need to take a look at. As for the console, this is the Micro Quantum Torpedo Phalanx Array. The passives on this are plus 10 max and plus 20 power to weapon subsystem for 30 seconds upon entering combat. And the clicky here is going to launch 20 torpedoes, and it's also going to give you a turn rate and flight speed buff that is pretty substantial for 8 seconds. So for the 20 torpedoes, they're split up into 10 that go at the target you have selected, and then 10 that are going to seek out nearby foes. Each of them does quite a bit of kinetic damage, and each of them that hits is going to apply a kinetic damage resistance debuff of 10 for 25 seconds, and that will stack up to 10 times. So as the torpedoes land, they're debuffing, and each of the torpedoes afterwards is then going to be stronger and stronger. What makes this even better is that each of these torpedoes has a 1 kilometer AoE. So if you use this console on a group of grouped up enemies that you have grouped to be something like a gravity well, the amount of damage this can provide is substantial. And then the starship trait Angle on the Bow. This is going to provide some shield pen and damage for projectiles. So when dealing damage with a projectile, gain plus 20 shield pen skill and plus 5% increased damage Cat 1 for projectile weapons for 10 seconds, stacks up to 10 times. If you're doing a torp setup, this is a good budget trait, but it is not one of the top 7 traits that you're going to see on a high-end torp build. And next up is the Gagarin Merc Worker Battlecruiser and its KDF equivalent. So this is a ship primarily popular for its starship trait and twine tactical matrices, but some people do like to fly the ship itself as well. The ship is fine, it's got a 5-3 weapon setup, but it has dual Merc Worker specialization seating on it, so again, compared to some of the other ships I've looked at, it's not going to have the same performance potential. And if you're looking to get the best version of the ship, there is also a fleet version that does have a 10% boost to the hull and shield mod and an extra console. So if this is something that you want to fly, especially on multiple characters, the cost is going to be higher than some of the other ships I've looked at, as you're going to have to spend 20,000 fleet credits in a fleet ship module on each of the characters you want to get the fleet version on. But back to the big draw here, this is the Entwined Tactical Majesty Starship trait, and what this does is when you activate a torpedo spread, it's going to give you Fire at Will 1 and Cannon Scatter Volley 1. And the way that you can use this is on a Fire at Will setup, you can have a Torp Spread 1 on, and when your Fire at Will goes down, you can hit Torp Spread, and then you have Fire at Will 1 for 10 seconds. This makes this trait the best way to get high Fire at Will uptime. It's not the simplest to use, but compared to the other firing mode extenders for Fire at Will, it's the best option we have. And the other benefit to this trait is how it works with torpedoes. So when you activate Fire at Will or Cannon Scatter Volley, it's going to give you a Torp Spread 1. And with that, this is a trait that is very popular on torpedo builds or science builds that use torpedoes. The way you use this is you would hit Fire at Will, and then you have a Torp Spread 1. You'd fire that off, and then you could hit Cannon Scatter Volley, and you have another Torp Spread. So by doing this, you're able to get a bunch of Torp Spreads out on a Torp build without even having a Torpedo Spread slotted on your build. So while I do think the Gagarin is not as strong of a ship as it was a couple years ago, it is still capable, and with the Starship trait being so popular for a variety of builds, that's why I've still put it on this list. And next up is the Buran Command Dreadnought Cruiser and its KDF equivalent. So the benefit with this ship is that if you're looking to get into the tanking playstyle, this is a really great beginner platform. You're getting a lot of value from this. The ship is very capable, especially the fleet version, and the accessories are going to be of great benefit to you. And before I go over the stats, again, this is another ship that does have a fleet version. So if you're intending to get this ship, I would get the C-Store version first, because you have to get the C-Store one to get the trading console. And by getting the C-Store, you're going to discount the fleet version. So get the C-Store one, level it up to get the trait, and then move over to the fleet one and use your T6X upgrades on the fleet one, because if you upgrade the C-Store one, they're not going to carry over to the fleet version. And for the stats, I'll go over the C-Store first and then mention the changes with the fleet version afterwards. So this has a hull modifier of 1.4, shield mod of 1.2. It's got a 4-4 weapon setup, which is perfectly fine for a tank. It has 4 device slots. For the bridge officer setup, you're looking at a Lieutenant Tactical, Lieutenant Tac with Command, Commander Angel with Command, Lieutenant Commander Science, and a Lieutenant Universal. So the tac seating is a bit limited. You can't do a FA3, but you still have enough room to do an attack pattern beta 1, a FA in there. You could also run a Torp Spread for ETM. So you do still have room to run what you need to run. You also have the ability to run Suppression Barrage 3 on the Commander Inge, and you can also run a Gravwell 1 on the Lieutenant Commander Science. Console-wise, 3 tac, 4 Inge, and 3 psi. Base turn rate of 6, impulse of 0.15, inertia of 25, so this thing does not move very well. For the power buffs, +5 to weapons and aux, and then +10 to shields. It does have a hangar base, so you could put Type 7s on this if you wanted. It does have the ability to use dual cannons if you really wanted to, but for a tank setup, you'd be running beam arrays. Being a command ship, it does have the inspiration abilities, which is very beneficial. It does have some cruiser commands, specifically the weapon system efficiency, and most importantly for a tank, attract fire. And then it has the Dreadnought Cruiser Mastery package. Now, for the fleet version, most of the stats are the same. The hull modifier goes from 1.4 up to 1.54, which is pretty substantial. The shield mod goes up to 1.32, and you gain a 5th engineering console. And for the accessories, starting with the Starship trait Unified Engineering, this is used on a variety of tank builds and quite a few supports. So when you activate Auxiliary to Structural Integrity Field or any Command Bridge Officer ability, to team itself for 15 seconds, plus 10% max hull capacity, 10% recharge speed for bridge officer abilities, 10% flight turn rate and speed, and plus 50% hull regen. And if you have other players on your team using this trait, it does stack. And the console here is Ion Storm Generator. This is a good budget tank console. So the passives on this are plus 5% max hull capacity and 15% shield hit points. The clicky is going to do electrical damage, and if you have Threatening Stance enabled, it is going to give you plus 500% threat generation while the storm is active, which is up to 15 seconds. So if you're looking for a way to help boost your threat gen at certain parts of the content you're doing, then this console can help you out. And next up is the Cardassian Ghemor Intel Flight Deck Carrier. The two things to focus on here are the ship itself and the starship trait. The ship is a little bit weaker than the previous two I've looked at, but it is still a capable platform. So it's got a hull modifier of 1.35, shield mod of 1.1. It's a 5-3 weapon setup for device slots. For the bridge officer setup, you've got a lieutenant commander tac, a lieutenant commander engineering, which is by far the weak point on this ship, a commander engineer with intel, a lieutenant science, and an ensign universal with intel. So not as strong of a bridge officer setup, but still capable. Console wise, 3 tac, 5 inch, and 3 psi. Base turn rate of 8.5, impulse of 0.16, inertia of 30, so this thing is nowhere near as maneuverable as the other ships I've looked at. For the power buffs, plus 10 to weapons, plus 5 to shields and engines. It has 2 hangar bays, and by default it has the Cardassian Qugh fighters. They're not really that great versus the Type 7s. Then you have the Gather Intel Ship Mechanic. You have the Cruiser Command Array with shield frequency modulation and attract fire. And then you have the Flight Deck Cruiser Mastery Package. So if you're looking for something that has 2 hangar bays, a 5-3 weapon setup, and is in the Zen store, there's not really that many options, and of what's there, this is probably what you'd want to look at for most energy weapon setups. The bridge officer setup on here, again, is not perfect, but it is sufficient enough for a basic energy weapon setup. In addition, while you have this ship on the roster for your character, you're going to have the ability to acquire spiral wave disruptors from the Dill store. So if you're looking to pick those up for a disruptor setup, those are the best disruptors in the game. So picking this up is the cheapest way you're going to be able to unlock the ability to acquire those weapons. And the main reason that most folks are looking at this ship, aside from the spiral wave disruptor unlock, is for the starship trait, Calm Before the Storm. While you're in combat with this trait slotted, you're going to gain 1 stack of Calm every 2 seconds, and each stack is going to give you plus 5 all damage resistance rating. At 10 stacks of Calm, you're going to gain Storm. That's going to remove all stacks of Calm and all of that damage resistance that you've built up. And what that's going to do is provide you, for 20 seconds, 33% firing cycle haste for energy weapons, and then it's going to recharge your bridge officer abilities 33% faster for that 20 seconds. So in combat, this trait is up half the time. It's a good trait. It still sees a lot of use. At the very high end, there are better traits that we use in its place, but for budget to mid-range play, this is a great option. And now it's time for the rapid fire round. The 6 ships here are also quite good, but they're either a bit more niche, meaning they're not relevant to as many of you, or the accessories that make them special have alternative ways to obtain them that I'd recommend instead. And the first ship here in the rapid fire round is the Terran Eagle Pilot Raider. If you're looking to do torpedoes, this is the best ship in the current meta. And the reason for that is because it has a commander pilot and a lieutenant commander command, meaning it can still do concentrate firepower 3. And the reason that matters is because the console off of the ship, the Covert Warhead module, has a really interesting set of passives on it. The first is plus 28% projectile damage, and then the second is going to set shared torpedo recharge time to 1.5 seconds if it was longer, or to 0.5 seconds if equipped on a ship that has pilot maneuvers. And of course, the Terran Eagle Pilot Raider happens to be the only ship in the game that has a commander pilot and a lieutenant commander command. Having access to concentrate firepower 3 is critical to a high performance torpedo build, meaning that the Terran Eagle Pilot Raider has been the top torpedo platform ever since its introduction, and there are no alternatives. Next up is the Guardian Cruiser, or the Mirror Guardian Cruiser variant. These both give you the exact same console, the Particle Conversion Matrix. This console is extremely popular with the Uncon meta, and is quite powerful. The passive on it is plus 25.3% flight to turn rate, and then the clicky is going to give you 75% shield resistance for 20 seconds, basically setting you at max shield resistance. And as you get shot, incoming energy damage adds to self 10% energy damage and 10% exotic damage, both Cat 1, and both of those can stack up to 10 times. So you're getting a bit of survivability here, and if you are drawing threat, then you're also getting a bit of energy damage and exotic damage buff from this, up to 100% for both. And on a high uncon setup, those damage buffs can basically have 100% uptime. And next up, I want to shout out the Premonition Temporal Operative Science Spearhead. So the ship itself, I'm not the biggest fan of the layout they gave it, but the console off of it is actually pretty good, the Gemini device. Passive on this is plus 20% Cat 1 exotic damage, and then the clicky is going to summon in 2 copies of the USS Enterprise F, and it's going to give you plus 20% weapon firing cycle haste for 30 seconds. And this weapon firing cycle haste does also work for your experimental weapons, so if you're using the hexacannons, and you're on a high uncon setup, this can do really well. And for the summons here, the 2 copies of the Enterprise can do a good bit of damage on a high uncon setup, and the console having a 1 minute 30-second recharge does enable it to have a bit higher uptime than the other consoles out there. Next up is the Lola Intel Dyson Science Destroyer. The console off of this, the Proton Eruptor module, does quite well. It has a 1 minute recharge, and on a high uncon setup, even without being on an exotic focused build, this clicky can do quite well, and that does a fair bit of proton damage that ignores shields. So if you happen to have even a restricted T6 coupon and you have all the other stuff I've mentioned, even though this is a newer ship, it is still able to be acquired via a restricted coupon, so it might be worth checking out if you're looking for another fun high damage universal console clicky. And the last 2 here are Adaptive Emergency Systems and the Starship Trait Emergency Weapon Cycle. So there's a very similar conclusion to both of them, which is why I'm combining the discussion on them. For Adaptive Emergency Systems, this is a really great console for survivability and damage. The clicky is giving you plus 50 bonus all damage resistance for 30 seconds, plus 30% Cat 2 bonus all damage for 30 seconds, and then if you activate it while below 50% HP, the effects are increased by 50%. So the issue with this is the ships it comes off of, the original ships that you can get with the coupon, are the old engineering variants of the flagships, and they're just not that great anymore. And then for Emergency Weapon Cycle, this is a trait that many of you have probably heard of. It is extremely popular. When you activate emergency powered weapons, it gives you minus 50% weapon power cost for 30 seconds and 20% firing cycle haste for range weapons for 30 seconds. Again, the issue is the ships that it originally comes off of that you can acquire with the T6 coupon, the Arbiter, Karak, and Morgu, they're all a bit old. So the better route to obtain Emergency Weapon Cycle or Adaptive Emergency Systems in the current state of the game is to just get the Legendary Battlecruiser bundle during a sale. That bundle is going to cost you 7,800 Zen during a Legendary or bundle sale, and you're going to get a lot more for your money with that bundle. You're getting both of the items I've just talked about, along with some other traits and consoles. You're getting 2 really great Tier 6 ships, another T6 coupon, and a bunch of other fluff. So I wouldn't spend 6,000 Zen picking up 2 of those older ships just for those items when you can spend 7,800 and get this bundle that is giving you so much more for your money. The only way that I would go for those old T6 ships is if you're using restricted T6 coupons, you're just a purely free-to-play player, and you know that there's no way that you're going to put 7,800 Zen into the game to pick up the Legendary Battlecruiser bundle. And that wraps up my recommendations for the best ships that you can acquire in Star Trek Online for 3,000 Zen or with the Tier 6 coupon as of March 2025, pre-15th anniversary bundle. And like I said in the intro, if you have unrestricted T6 coupons, wait for my coverage of the 15th anniversary bundle before you make your final decision. There's a chance that one of those ships may end up taking your coupon instead. And like I said also, I'll have any coverage of the 15th bundle linked in the pinned comment below. And if any of those ships other than the Ark Royal end up being worth recommending, I'll be including a short write-up of them in the pinned comment there as well. And that is it for this video, so if you guys have any feedback about the format, or if you agree or disagree with any of my recommendations, leave a comment down below. And as always, thank you to all channel members and viewers for the continued support. See you guys around.